For years, I have not been happy with the history of French Canada and the canoe as it's been portrayed in the textbooks and other books. And so I started to work on this starting back 8 years ago. And the first paper I produced out of it was called In Search of the Savage Sauvage, and I'll get onto that later. But then in early 2004, when I was sitting down to just to get the first draft of the whole thing underway and tidy it together into a book, all the bits and pieces, the bricolage of professor's work, I got a phone call from a friend of mine, Donald Savoy, who was then the executive director of the Gomery Commission. And he said, "Ned, what are you doing for the next few months?" And I said, "Well, I'm writing a book on the canoe in French Canada." And he said, "Well, drop it. I want you to run a research program." And so about 4 years later, when I could get my head above water again, I started back on this, and then I got distracted again, and it was not my fault. I just am easily distractible. That's not my fault. And so this is trying to get back, and what I want to do is share with you some thoughts. And I'm going to do it mainly by talking about people. And they're all pretty well French, but there will be some others who are non-French come up, like Condiaronc down there, also known as Le Rat. He was, of course, a Huron chief. But I just want to get you to think about this from a perspective which is not the one that we normally think about French-Canadian history, because the history as it appears in the textbooks was written either by Jesuit missionaries or by military people or by our governors of the colony, and it has an aura about it, a sort of sanctimonious, beneficent manipulation, management of people's lives, which I really don't like. So, as I was saying to Jim earlier, this is closer to what is called the what's that name again? My brain's going to mush. The history of the ordinary people, subaltern history. Not talking about the great men and their deeds, but talking about people like us who were doing things back then. Now, the problem with doing that with the French in North America is that the ordinary people didn't read or write, most of them. And so a lot of the book itself is about people who either didn't read or write or had very limited ability, but you have to still draw on the written records. And so what I decided to do was deal with the oddballs. And I'm going to talk primarily about 3 people, but there will be others from the cast of characters. The reason that this is produced is that my wife said, 1, I mumble when I'm talking, and 2, that nobody knows the names, and so please give them something they can read at, and so you know who I'm talking about when I get there. So, you've got that. Now, the 3 characters that I want to talk about are Gabriel Sagard, whom you'll see there, Louis Armand de l'Homme d'Ars, le Baron de la Hontin, who you'll also see on there, and the third one is the Cadots, Jean-Baptiste Cadot and his son Michel Cadot. And but there'll be a lot of other people who come in. Now, where did the textbooks go wrong? Number 1, if you read the English translations, the still extant ones, and especially the early ones with the Jesuit relations, etc., you will find the French word sauvage translated as savage. So what it suggests is the French met savages in North America. It first struck me that this was a mistranslation when I was traveling on an airplane to India with a French Canadian sitting beside me, and I had a bottle of like this, for all the bugs in India. And I looked at the French, and it said wild, deep woods off on one side. And I looked at the other side, the French, and it said off région sauvage. And so I translated that into English. Does this mean these are savage regions? And the French Canadian beside me said, no, it means a totally different thing. And then I realized that if I had bought wild blueberries in Quebec, they would be bleuets sauvages, which doesn't mean that they're going to bite you or sting you or anything. It just means that they're wild. And yeah, I wrote this article, The Search of the Savage Sauvage, and came to the conclusion in that, which I still believe, that a far better translation than sauvage into savage would be as men from the woods, or I would prefer, if I was doing it nowadays, to call them Indians, or use the French expression Amerindians, Amérindiens, and American Indians, in other words, to distinguish from the others, and leave it neutral like that, because that's what the word sauvage in French meant. And to the people, in the French people who wrote at the time, I think it meant only two things. One, that they were not French, and two, they were not Christian. And everywhere in the literature I find the description of the savages, as Gabriel Sagar, you'll hear in a jiff, said, mon sauvage est plus poli que la plupart des gens civilisés, which has been translated in English quite accurately, I think, as saying that the Indian who accompanied me was more civilized than civilized Frenchmen. And so, yeah, that's number one. There's a misperception right down there, I think, is what we were taught. Number two, the Jesuits were the first missionaries in Huronia. Wrong. I brought with me, and you're welcome to look at them afterwards, a book. This is called Le Grand Voyage du Pays des Hurons, The Long Journey into the Country of the Hurons, written by Gabriel Sagar, and it was published, I believe, in 1726. He made his journey there in 1723-24, and even then one of the missionaries who accompanied him was Le Caron, who had been in Huronia 15 years earlier, long before Champlain got there, and long before the Jesuits hit Huronia. Now, what happened with that, just to make a long, fascinating story short, is that Gabriel Sagar was a Récollet, which is a minor, a frere minor of the associated with the Franciscans, and the Récollets were competing with the Jesuits for the missionaries for the mission stations, the right to have missionaries in Canada, and the Jesuits, of course, won, but Gabriel Sagar and other people wrote this in Paris, in the space part of Sagar's notes, after he'd returned to France as a justification for the Récollet missionary action in Canada, which never happened after that. It was a battle fought in the courts of France at the time. One of the outcomes of it is that you can read all the Jesuit letters, everything, all the relations. You won't find the Récollets mentioned in it. And if you read this book and the other stuff that Sagar wrote, you will not find the Jesuits mentioned, nor will you find Champlain mentioned in it. And in no place in Champlain will you find Sagar mentioned, but they knew each other. And this, as I say, was a battle for the missions, and the Récollets lost. Now, I find this one the most sympathetic, sympathique in the French there, of the missionary things. The Jesuits always scare me. Sagar I could consider a friend. So we'll leave that. That's one and two.